Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening, from wherever across the world you are patching into this event. Thank you very much for joining us for this virtual launch of the latest edition of the Guide to the Paris Agreement. My name is Kiran Sura, for those of you who don't know me. I'm an assistant director in PricewaterhouseCoopers in the climate change team. I'm also head of the Climate Ambition Support Alliance programme, which is the UK government's flagship programme to support the participation and engagement of developing country negotiators on climate change in international climate change negotiations. So over the next hour, we'll be hearing from a very distinguished panel of speakers who will tell us a little bit more about this guidebook, which we're launching today, as well as sharing their reflections on what it means to be a climate negotiator from a developing country, and also to discuss the state of negotiations as they are now, especially in light of the current COVID and pandemic crisis that we're all having to live through. Before I hand over to the first of our speakers, I wanted to just do a little bit of virtual housekeeping, which I'm sure you're all getting very familiar with now. Firstly, just wanted to let you know that this event is being recorded, so please do feel free to share this with friends and colleagues who are not able to join the live launch for whatever reason. Secondly, you've all been muted by our Blue Jeans guru, David. Therefore, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit to any of the speakers or all of the panel, please use the QA function that's on the platform. Hopefully you'll see a little icon there, so please submit your questions via that icon, and please do put your name and where you're from or your affiliation is. We'll have 15 minutes towards the end of the seminar to take Q&A. And thirdly, and perhaps most excitingly, we're running a parallel virtual quiz during this event. So each of our speakers, after their presentations, will be posing one question to you. It will be a Paris Agreement related question. Don't worry about scribbling these down in real time, because we will share all the questions with you at the end of the event, along with details of how you submit your answers. And for all of you who manage to get all the answers correct, you will secure yourself a limited edition hard copy of the guidebook to the Paris Agreement. So very exciting quiz. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to the first of our speakers. At the end of March, under the umbrella of the European Capacity Building Initiative, so ECBI, Oxford Climate Policy and Legal Response International published a paperback guide to the Paris Agreement. Andrew, our first speaker, heads up the Policy and Publications Unit at ECBI and is here to tell us a little bit more about the guide itself. Andrew.
Yeah, that's better. Thanks, Kiran. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Little did we know when we were working on the book that we'd be forced to have an online launch. I don't think we imagined that. And right now we have all those boxes behind me, are copies of the book that we'd hope to hand out to you at our training meetings and at the SVs, etc. But all that's been delayed. I guess we just have to look at the positive side, which is that today we can have many more of you at the event than we could have at a physical launch if we'd had it. And also that we can be innovative about it, the event today. We can make it fun. We could have made it a pajama party launch, for instance. And maybe many of you, depending on your time zone, are in your pajamas watching us. So we'll try to keep this light. So just very briefly about myself, as Kiran said, I currently head the Publications and Policy Analysis Unit at ECBI. And I've worked mainly with NGOs in the past, with the Center for Science and Environment in Delhi and with Oxfam here in Oxford. I've also been with UNEP in Kenya. And when it comes to the climate negotiations, I'm a bit of a brontosaurus or a diplodocus, whatever, as long as it's a vegetarian. And I've been around for quite a while. So I was literally thrown into the deep end in Kyoto when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated in 1997. and I was completely clueless about climate change. But I found out really quickly just how deeply political the negotiations were and how many layers of injustice it coexisted in the process. So, I mean, in those days, well, the negotiations have always been political because I guess people see them as a threat to the very basis of industrialization and development as we've come to know it in the past decades. That's a model that's heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And countries have seen cutting emissions as basically compromising development. So my early focus in the negotiations was related to mitigation. It was basically what most people spoke about those days, where there was very little adaptation or other issues on the table. And I was focused on the fact that there really was no clear way of pinning down responsibility on countries that were historically and currently responsible for emissions. So efforts were made, and there were quite a few good proposals on the table to either use, per capita emissions, per capita income, capability thresholds, sort of a mix of those. But unfortunately, I mean, rich countries have been very deft at batting away any proposal to pin down responsibility. And let's admit it, developing countries have been either too weak, too unprepared, or too disorganized to ensure that there was a sound basis on which responsibility for climate change could be decided. So what happened is that this laid a really shaky foundation to the negotiations, full of distrust. And over time, this distrust has only grown because it has appeared that countries are either only interested in escaping responsibility altogether by weakening the negotiations, withdrawing from the protocol, the agreement, and doing as little as possible, basically wasting a whole lot of time. And there are other issues that have contributed to this lack of trust over time. I mean, on the one hand, it's the overall dynamic of sustainable development, with the whole sort of push and pull between environment and development, the issue of means of implementation, finance, capacity building, and technology. And this foundation of distrust has really had deep implications for the effectiveness of the negotiations. So that was one issue, the fact that there was such low trust. The second level of justice that was very visible in the late 70s to early 2000s was that of representation. I said earlier that developing countries were perhaps too weak, and there was actually a massive disparity in the size and capability of delegation. So on the one hand, you had industrialized country delegations, which had, hundreds of people with all kinds of expertise represented. You had properly trained negotiators, lawyers, etc. And the delegations of developing countries were tiny in comparison, often just one or two bureaucrats whose day job really had very little to do with climate change. And they were just sort of thrown into this technical, complex negotiation, not only to represent, and I say him because it was mostly men, his country in a life and death matter, but without any preparation or training. So ECBI was set up in 2005 to address these two issues that I mentioned. On the one hand, the lack of trust between countries, and on the other hand, the injustice of representation of particularly poor and weak populations and countries. So ECBI is a network of organizations. It's three organizations: Oxford Climate Policy, IIED, International Institute for Environment and Development in London, and Legal Response International, LRI. And we to address these two issues, we had on the one hand the Oxford seminars, which take place annually in Oxford. This is an event for senior negotiators, heads of groups of countries, etc. We have 3 days in Oxford where the developing country negotiators discuss issues amongst themselves that they think are going to be crux at the upcoming negotiations. The event takes place around August. And then we have the European negotiators, senior negotiators who come and join them. And this, it was simply a matter of giving people a chance to interact as human beings, to be able to sort of try and understand where they were coming from, and not just sort of speak as countries and, sort of anonymize the whole thing. And then on the other hand, with IIED and LRI, we have training workshops for new negotiators from developing countries. So we have bursaries. We have LRI provides technical and legal support during the negotiations. Over time, we are becoming more and more focused on also trying to address gender disparity, so by giving priority to training women. So the guide that we're launching today is part of that capacity building mandate of ECBI. It's basically an effort to make the negotiations more accessible and understandable to negotiators from developing countries. So we very much try to have a developing country perspective. Though the guide, I have to say, I worked with lawyers, so it's very neutral, I hope, Christoph, but also for policymakers in developing countries. So we try to explain each article, and then we, for starters, included a box at the end which says what are the implications for developing countries of this particular article. And in future, we hope to sort of develop that part further to try and understand what does it mean for developing countries, what are the experiences that developing countries have in implementation that perhaps have to be addressed at the international level. And this guide is part of a series. So we have a thematic guide on a whole lot of issues. These are all online. If you go to the ECBI website on technology, capacity building, on NDCs, transparency, etc., and we're constantly updating them. So if you go to ecbi.org, you have these, and we have a limited number of hard copies, but we prioritize developing country negotiators. So if there are any of you out there who'd like copies, please write to me. There are advantages in the digital version because we include the links to decisions. So unless the UNFCCC has moved those links, then you can access them easier. So over time, there's been, for those of you who've been long enough, you'll see that there's actually been a remarkable sort of improvement in the capacity of delegations. Now you have developing countries with much larger delegations as well, but obviously not enough. And it seems to be an endless thing because there's constantly capacity loss. So you've got to continue to train negotiators, make sure that that keeps going on. But on the other hand, the trust issue has been far more difficult. The progress is incremental, and you can basically only try to address it issue by issue. So, and over time, the problem is that these issues keep growing. So, for instance, I said earlier the focus was on mitigation, but then as adaptation needs became more and more tangible, loss and damage, it could no longer be swept under the carpet. Then there was another reason for distrust. It was that developing countries felt that developed countries were not necessarily prioritizing adaptation or means of implementation or loss and damage. And as you'll read in the introduction to the guide, this was quite a major issue in the run-up to in the negotiations for the Paris Agreement. And the extent to which it was achieved in the end, any balance between these issues, is perhaps debatable, but at least in my opinion, it's clear that mitigation elements are better defined, adaptation means of implementation issues less so currently. And that brings me to the current situation that we're in. So the COVID crisis is seen by many as sort of a turning point in our history as a human race. In the climate context, at least for me, where I'm sitting in a developed country, the focus is mainly on seeing this as an opportunity to deliver a death blow to fossil fuels, to promote renewables and rescue packages that governments are announcing. So everyone's talking about a green stimulus and opposing funding to revive fossil fuel based industries. I mean, this is important, no doubt. But the other half of the story is once again being forgotten, because the COVID crisis is sort of a dress rehearsal for us to see how we respond as a global community when we see other countries in distress and are faced by a common enemy that, we can only destroy if we work together. We know for a fact that these kinds of situations are going to rise more and more frequently in future because of climate change. So you think that people see the urgency, as in response to this crisis, they see the urgency of working together as a global community, pushing back against nationalism that's been growing even before this crisis began. But that's not what's happened. Unfortunately, you countries have once again just ended up showing how selfish and nationalistic they can be. So they've been, for instance, the outbidding for essential supplies, patents to vaccines. One country described it as modern piracy. You've had, things. And it's also shameful that the UN Security Council has not yet been able to agree a resolution on the COVID crisis because of the whole WHO issue, whether it should be mentioned or not. So this is not a very good sign for what is to come. And the other issue again is that the whole resilience and support is being sidelined once again in the response to the COVID crisis. We know that this is going to cause a deep recession. There are already reports on how this is undermining progress on reducing poverty around the world. You had last week the UN Secretary General's report on progress on the SDGs, and he says very clearly there that, again, it's going to be the LDCs, the SIDS, the LLDCs, other vulnerable countries that are going to be the worst hit because they're the ones that have fragile health systems, they have limited social protection systems, they have limited financial other resources, they're vulnerable to shocks, they depend on international trade. And these are precisely the areas that we need to strengthen in the climate context as well to increase resilience to climate impacts. But so far, there's really been no discussion on how we can come together as a global community to reduce the impact on poor countries and on poor people in the crisis. So right now, at least in my opinion, while on the one hand, it may seem churlish to ask struggling countries to focus on mitigation at this point, what this pandemic intuitively suggests is that the world needs to come together to build resilience, particularly of the poor, because even the rich are only as safe as the poorest. I mean, we really need to understand that fact. And the urgent need for this hour is for global efforts to revamp the sectors that are related to basic needs, whether that's health or food, social security, and to address our ability to react to a global crisis. This is, what we need to do also in the climate change context. And so the focus shouldn't be only on sort of the green stimulus package and on mitigation, but also on a global response for resilience building. And this is going to really help also in the trust issue, because can you imagine? I mean, it'll be like a message that to show that developed countries just don't use every opportunity to push mitigation, that they can be more sensitive than that they can see the suffering that such crises cause in poor countries, and they can lead a global effort with resilience and adaptation as a priority. And for instance, if the UK were to focus COP26 on a resilient and safe future, can you just imagine the trust building quotient of something like that if it comes from the UK? So let's not just talk about what countries can do, in the conversation up ahead on mitigation in their NDCs. Let's even also take into account that how do we increase our commitment to global resilience building in the face of such global emergencies. So I'm going to leave it there and say to you that I risked working with lawyers on this book. Of course, they were the best kind. They were very nice. I think they were for Nikiti only once or twice while we were doing it. So please read it, use it, review it, send us your comments and suggestions. The thing is, we have to update this, right? Because they've not yet finished the Paris rule book. So we'll have to come back to it. And your suggestions and comments will be really useful. We can use that opportunity. So I'd also like to take this time to thank everybody, Kishan, Selam, Daniel, everybody, Lavanya, all the reviewers who gave us comments and suggestions, and obviously to the LRI team because they pulled it all through in record time. I think, managed to get it out there in good time from the time we actually got serious on it. So I'll end with my quiz question. And my question is, what are the three lead organizations, the partner organizations of the ECDI? So I'll leave you with that. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So much food for thought there, especially in terms of our sort of response to COVID in light of kind of the looming climate crises. And I think hopefully, Kishan, at the end, when we circle back to you, I think you'll be picking up on some of these threads, looking forward to the state of current negotiations. Christoph, turning to you next. So Christoph is the Executive Director of Legal Response International. Christoph, it'd be great to hear a little bit about how LRI has been involved in the development of the guide, but also sort of how you more broadly support some developing country negotiators.
Thank you very much, Kiran, and thank you all for joining us in our little event today. I'm the Executive Director of LRI. I've spent many years working in and around the climate negotiations. I've also been part of a committee that has developed legal principles related to climate change, and the idea initially of this ILA committee was to influence the outcome of the Paris negotiations. I think we've pretty much failed on this front. So most lawyers would probably agree if I said Paris Agreement is not yet really a great success story. At this stage, it does not really provide the approaches and the radical approaches and solutions that we need in order to address the climate catastrophe. But it's only a framework agreement, and it's probably too early to judge. And there's still a lot the parties can do to make it stronger and more ambitious. And most importantly, it is also the only international forum where law and policymakers from vulnerable societies, from indigenous peoples, from civil society, from small islands can make their voices heard. So that's why we as lawyers and we as an organization, LRI, work in and around the negotiations. We aim to level the playing field between actors, and for that purpose, we offer free legal advice and assistance to negotiation teams from low-income and particularly vulnerable developing countries and all civil society observer organizations. And we do this with the very generous support of barrister chambers, universities, and law firms. Initially, our advice was very much focused on the international negotiations. Increasingly, it's moving towards domestic implementation. What should domestic laws, rules, and regulations look like? Which also very much mirrors the shift that the negotiations are kind of indicating at the moment, more towards implementation. We've got the international rules. Now, let's make them meaningful on the ground and in practice. And I also have to say that there are more and more lawyers from developing countries that get involved in our service. So I would like to use this opportunity to call on all law and policymakers out there who might be listening in on this to use our service. We are, despite the lockdown, we are open for business. And many lawyers that work in a commercial environment actually have a bit more time at the moment because they are on furlough, they work part-time, and are really happy to help. So by all means, drop us an email and let's discuss whatever issue concerns you at the moment. Our advice is peer-reviewed, it's independent, absolutely neutral, and while we are, of course, committed to protecting the planet and finding equitable responses to the climate emergency, we do not push or promote any specific positions. So please get in touch. And I think that this approach, if you have a look at the guide, you'll also see reflected in our explanations to the various articles. It's not an academic paper, and the guide also does not seek to assess the structure, architecture, success of the Paris Agreement. At this stage, it really is an attempt to help people understand the rules of the Paris Agreement. The CASA program has called it an invaluable companion to all negotiators, policy analysts, and advocates who are following the climate negotiation. That's very nice. Thank you very much. But I leave it to all of you to decide whether it is that useful. And I have to say that in order to understand the Paris Agreement, it's not just enough to read the provisions and articles of the agreement anymore. It is a living document, and the parties already used the last 2-3 years to add to the initial text and sometimes to expand it, go beyond it. So whether it's loss and damage, finance, equity, distinctions between parties, there are lots of issues that are still pending, and we also try to flag those and try to indicate where the negotiations need to make further progress in the future. And in this connection, I would also really recommend the electronic version. The electronic version has direct links to a lot of the COP decisions. So it might actually be easier at times to work with that. But as I said before, the Paris Agreement is very much a living instrument, and so is this guide. So please send us your feedback. It's important. We'll be working on another edition soon, and I think it's important that we find the right approaches and the right language to make this agreement, which is potentially incredibly important for all of us, the content accessible, and also explain to law and policymakers on the ground how they need to integrate that into their domestic legal orders and sets of rules and regulations. And on a few occasions, we've also highlighted where some of the important issues that are currently in the discussion, like fossil fuel subsidies or the removal of fossil fuel subsidies, redirecting private investment from the north to the south, could be addressed under the existing rules and regulations of the Paris Agreement. But for any further specific legal questions, I would really urge you to either get in touch or use our extensive database of legal advice. And here I just want to flag 3 pieces of advice that we've recently posted. One is on the future governance of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. That's probably very much an issue for the hardcore negotiation nerds, but in the COVID-19 context, much more topical, probably, piece of advice on how countries could pursue their goals under the Paris Agreement, the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, and the Sustainable Development Goals in a more integrated manner. And another piece of advice on joint NDCs, on joint nationally determined contributions, where countries have to indicate a joint commitment, but at the same time, they also now have to notify the Secretariat of the individual targets of each member country. And that's, of course, an area where, you know, when the EU comes out of the lockdown, they might shine or not. But now I have a question for you. I have 25 of our guides to give away. I have another box here, Anju, and my question is, what is the first word in Article 4, Paragraph 1 of the Paris Agreement? So just the first word in that paragraph, Article 4, Paragraph 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. And as I mentioned earlier, for everyone joining us, the questions will be put to you all on a slide at the end of this event as well. So don't feel like you need to write all this down. Thank you very much, Christoph. So I want to bring Salam in. So Salam is a seasoned developing country climate negotiator from Ethiopia. And Salam, Anju and Christoph, and I think we all know that the playing field, the climate negotiations playing field is inherently uneven for developing countries on so many different levels. And I hope programs like CASA and of course this really important guidebook help support the capacity building of developing country negotiators. But it only goes a small way to trying to level that playing field. It'd be really interesting to hear from you sort of how you've used the guide and how your fellow negotiators have used the guide, and what more can be done to support developing country negotiators and really sort of strengthen developing country participation and engagement.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you all for joining us. I think maybe to start a bit of how I started involving in these processes, in particular in the negotiation. It was working with the government that enabled me to see how the multilateral environmental agreements work. So as you indicated, it could be a bit overwhelming coming for the first time to the UNFCCC negotiation, as things are very different even from other multilateral processes. So it was very important to understand how the processes work, what the implications are, and how this has impacted the overall outcome. I mean, in my view, the UNFCCC is one of the strongest multilateral institutions. It has put climate change on the agenda, and to some extent also a venue where developing countries have called on for more action, fairness, equity. Was it enough? Is it sufficient enough? Is another question and another debate. So, but this process has, at least to some extent, enabled countries to engage globally and come together to address climate change. In particular, to the guide, it's very useful. In particular, to negotiators that are new and young. So even with the African group, so I should have mentioned this. I work with the African group of negotiators. For the group, we had a young lawyers mentoring program where we mentored young lawyers from different African countries. So that was during the Paris negotiations. So we tried to involve young negotiators in the development of the text and actually reviewing of the text and so on. So this, and also we tried to make sure that the lawyers had expertise. So one would focus on mitigation, the other would focus on the adaptation. So at the end, we had quite a few lawyers that were really experts on the thematic areas. So that program to some extent is there, and we work with African countries supporting during the negotiation and also in the implementation process. But this guide is very useful as it brings together what has happened in Paris and what happened after Paris. So that context is handy because sometimes it's very difficult to go even to the UNFCCC and to identify specific decisions. So this is very useful in really bringing the context. This is what has happened. This is the obligation. And in order to implement this obligation, this additional decisions have been reached in Katowice and so on. So it even has the most recent decisions from Katowice. So how it can be improved, maybe a bit on this, as we have seen the challenge with the negotiation is one, trust, and that trust is due to the political difference and the difference in understanding of what the priority should be. So it could, to some extent, reading the guide itself would provide, okay, what is the obligation? What does Paris say? What does the decision say? But when one goes into the negotiation, there could be a different reflection. Some parties have a different understanding of a particular decision, and this has happened in many different times. So it would be important if we provided, okay, what was the concern of developing countries, for example, during Paris, the adaptation, global goal for adaptation, how was it reached? What was the call from developing countries, so that, yes, the global goal for adaptation was reached, but what was the context? What was the deals behind? What was the understanding? So it could make it a more detailed book or guide, but it's very important to also give the context to, especially to a new negotiator, to understand how these decisions have been reached, what was the deals or what was the understanding in the room, and what would it mean for future decision-making processes, because we have seen challenge in particular with the Warsaw governing arrangements, right? So these things have history, and this extent should be reflected. And maybe to add a bit more, especially this year was considered as a very important year under the Paris Agreement, because the expectation was that we would be completing the rules that were necessary to start the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So that is some challenge that we are facing. But also in the meantime, as Andrew have said, we have seen how countries can respond to impacts and what the efforts they have put on the table. So the discussion of trust, in particular to the means of implementation, the challenge of that 100 billion by 2020, where we see now billions is will be a question to developing countries. So I think this is also something that COP26 in particular with their finance agenda is considering. And also maybe one area we can explore from this is how countries have actually cooperated. We have seen approval processes that has been expedited for technology, for vaccination. These are some of the things that we can learn and bring to the climate change processes, in particular to vulnerable countries in the response of the climate emergency. Cooperation models where doctors were going around borders, Cuban doctors coming to Italy to support without these credential requirements and so on. So maybe these are a way, or it could be a year where we learn lessons in actual resilience building and what it means and how countries can prepare. So that could maybe align with the process of the reviewing of NDCs, updating of NDCs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selam. Could you please share your quiz question with the participants?
Yeah, sorry. So my question is, if they could name one of the principles of Article 15, which is the Compliance Committee of the Paris Agreement. Yeah, what's the principle of the Article 15? Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Selam. I think there are some very real and some very important lessons to be learned here in our response to COVID in terms of both resilience and global cooperation. And I suspect our next speaker and our final speaker, Kishan, may touch upon some of these. Kishan, you've worn many hats in the process, many important hats in the process. You've been integral in helping us to get where we are. I doubt there have been many situations as the one we find ourselves in under the UNFCCC previously, perhaps bar the 2008 financial crisis. These are indeed unique times. They present unique challenges. And I guess some might say they do present possibly some unique opportunities. So really interested to kind of hear your thoughts on where you feel that the state of negotiations currently is. We've got the pandemic, we've got the technical SB negotiations sort of delayed, the COPs delayed. So really keen to sort of get your thoughts on where we are and what this means for the process. Easy questions.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. Maybe I should start my presentation in an unusual way by saying thank you first to the organizers and the opportunity to share thoughts on a critical issue and a critical event. I think a significant launch of a guide that we've heard from the other speakers on regarding its value and so on. But I think maybe I should start where Andrew perhaps left off. That is understanding the context of the agreement itself. It's not a standalone agreement, but it has a specific temporal context in the evolution of the climate change regime. So without going into a climate 101 sort of lecture or presentation, it is always useful to look back and backcast where we started and where we ended up, so that it has to be viewed in that context. We all know, of course, the first international instrument was the convention itself that laid out basically the framework and the fundamentals of the regime. And in so doing, it laid out various principles, and those principles were relied on and applied in the evolution of the rules and the application of climate action in various countries. And those included, for example, differentiation among parties into annexes, the Annex 1 and Annex 2 and non-Annex 1, and the issue of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. The issues relating to the obligations of developed countries in provision of finance and capacity building and technology transfer, and so on. But perhaps the That framework convention may have been premised on a tacit acknowledgement, even though it was aired to the contrary, of historical responsibility and the need for developed countries to take the lead in addressing climate action globally. And therefore, that foundation, of course, evolved into other instruments, including the Kyoto Protocol, as a result of the recognition that the convention itself was not robust enough to achieve the objectives of the convention itself, the stabilization of the atmosphere to avoid catastrophic climate change. And therefore, the Kyoto Protocol laid down some top-down legally binding targets for industrialized countries in various commitment periods. Soon after, of course, the withdrawal of a major party that accounted then for almost a third of global emissions threw some cold water on it and undermined the confidence of implementing the KP. As a result, the obvious, I think, or the expected happened. Countries did not meet targets. There was a difficulty in agreeing on a second commitment period. It still has not been ratified or into force yet. And there were indications that parties may not ratify this second commitment period. So it quickly dawned on countries that some new dispensation in multilateral climate action had to be formulated. And it started with the Bali Action Plan and the Copenhagen Accord. And of course, without going into the details of what happened there, important lessons had to be drawn from the Bali Action process and the Copenhagen Accord in terms of the transparency of the process, the inclusiveness. But what the Copenhagen Accord did, of course, is that it established novel principles on financing and mitigation commitments, because then for the first time we saw voluntary action being taken by developing countries, and so that blurred sort of the north-south divide that was entrenched in the annexes of the convention. But of course, the world itself also changed in many ways from the days of the Kyoto Protocol, when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated. Emerging economies, the major economies, started to be recognized for increasing greenhouse gas emissions. For example, China became the leading emitter of greenhouse gases, and therefore that increased recognition for a new dispensation of global climate policy was recognized, and with the advent of the Durban platform. And the lessons learned from the Copenhagen Accord, I think, were aptly reflected in the Durban decision. So, for example, we saw a more careful wording and more definitive statements of what the intended outcome of the process was to be, the legal form. But more importantly, it was to be applicable to all parties, no differentiation between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 and developed and developing countries. Of course, the major challenges in negotiating such an instrument, of course, played out in the negotiations. So there were attempts to, of course, maintain the status quo of the differentiation and the role of all, how that juxtaposes against the role of all parties as per the Durban decision. The underlying principle of a party-driven process, again, a lesson learned from the Copenhagen process, was always aired. And interestingly, it was so much echoed that even the authority of the chairs in the process were openly questioned. So the Paris Agreement, therefore, is a culmination of the agreement for global action in a true sense, where all parties have a role to play, and therefore represented a major shift from the Kyoto Protocol. It therefore represents a bottom-up approach. There is no longer an annexization, if I want to say, of parties, and actions were now or are now nationally determined. So it's no longer top-down; it's a bottom-up. The compliance regime, for example, is non-punitive compared, for example, to the more robust regime of the Kyoto Protocol, and instead now provides, and entrenched in the agreement, peer review stock takes to assess progress to reaching the objectives of the Paris Agreement. But still, even then, there are provisions for flexibility, particularly in Article 13, the transparency framework, which allows for equity and scrutiny of actions. But a major modification in the Paris Agreement is the modification of the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which is now qualified further by stating in light of national circumstances. Therefore, and thereby anticipating that countries will develop capacity to do more, and therefore we can see going forward that this sort of capacity building and development of capacity will result in negotiations for more action from parties. One of the major issues and takeaways from the Paris Agreement was the separation of general adaptation principles into a loss and damage focus. I think that was a critical part of the Paris Agreement that now looks at permanent loss and damage from the effects of climate change and how those are to be addressed. Of course, the financing commitments of developed countries remain. But the challenge again remains with the implementation and understanding the Paris Agreement itself. And hence the Katowice package that was negotiated at COP24 is instructive in terms of providing that kind of clarity as to how parties may now act to implement the Paris Agreement. Of course, there are remaining and outstanding issues to be agreed on, for example, markets, common time frames, the transparency framework. But I think those challenges themselves are a testimony to the understanding of the intent and the content of the various aspects of the Paris Agreement. And therefore, it will continue to evolve as implementation rolls out in the future. Therefore, the Paris Agreement guide of the ECBI is both timely, I think, and critical in order to lend the understanding of the Paris Agreement. And by so doing, it will inspire, I think, mutual trust and confidence, something that has waned in the process. And you have crests and troughs. But I think this understanding, new aid in understanding, will of course inspire that. It will inform the evolving rulemaking by getting a better grasp of the articles and what they mean and what they intended, and through an aiding of the interpretation. And more importantly, I think, and Selim, I think, touched on it, is the identification of the subtle nuances between the issues and the articles, which, although subtle, can actually be very significant in the actual negotiations going forward, and can play out in a significant way. So those are some of that's the context in where we find the Paris Agreement in the evolving international policy framework, and the value of the Paris Agreement guide in that context as well. The COVID-19 crisis, of course, poses challenges to all spheres of development, and climate change is perhaps the most glaring one. So therefore, the time delays, I think, it's always and often said, we should not let a good crisis go to waste. And I think here now lies several opportunities for reflection. It sort of eases the burden a bit, and provides space for thinking, for strategizing, for understanding and internal reflection of how we can now collectively address some of these issues to address climate action going forward. It also provides the opportunity to give us critical lessons on how the world can actually function in light of the fears that I think Andrew referred to, the development fears and the energy fears and so on. I think it's given us a sort of real-life laboratory experiment of how the world can function in a crisis, in a lockdown, and therefore I think those lessons can now be translated into addressing the climate change emergency, because no doubt it is an emergency. We can quarantine from COVID-19, can't quarantine from climate change. And that, I think, is just one of the stark realizations that we have going forward. So that this period of inertia in the process, but certainly not inertia in terms of the ongoing and ensuing discussions, because I think I've been attending virtually at least many of these discussions online, and so that momentum is there. It's gathering more and more as we speak. So I think a lot of the brainstorming is happening. This incubation period, if you want to call it that, I think would serve us all well in terms of clearing some of the brush from the issues, and that is where the Paris Agreement guide, I think, can provide some of the cutting or the hedging tools to cut to the chase and to focus on some of the core issues that we can now use that understanding to go forward towards the SBs. Hopefully it will be in October, so there's no pressure now of preparing for issues to be negotiated at the SBs at the COP. But of course, it has to be tempered against too much time going forward. So the devil finds work for idle hands. we hope that will not be the case. So I think it's an opportunity. I think the COVID crisis is an opportunity that should not be wasted. I think a forum like this one can aid in understanding the issues going forward. So I know before Kieran asks me to state my question, let me state my question at the closing, and it is this. And the question is, well, it's prefaced by a statement, and then the question. So there is a standalone issue in the Paris Agreement that is very important to a group of parties. Which article addresses it, and what does it address? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kishan, and thank you to all our speakers. So we're now going to move into Q&A, and I've done a bad job at timekeeping, so we're a little bit behind, but we've got some juicy questions. So I'm going to pose some questions to our panel. Let me just get these up. So perhaps we'll start off with one or two of the easier questions, and this is for everybody. So as we know, 2020 was supposed to be the year of ambition, but it was also critically the year that countries were supposed to submit new, enhanced, revised NDCs to ramp up global emissions to keep the Paris goals alive. You all alluded to the fact, and Kishan and Salam, you've talked about the fact that NDCs are a bottom-up approach. You know, it was a different approach underpinning the Paris Agreement, and the bottom-up approach was there to reflect the differing national circumstances of each party. But the question is, why are there so many different ways of reporting NDCs? And is there a plan in place to try and standardize reporting versus absolute targets versus base year intensity targets, different base years? So do you have any insight into where NDC reporting may be heading? I don't know if one person wants to take that. You can maybe put your hand up, unmute yourselves. No one wants to take it? Go on, Salam. You have to unmute yourself, and then, yeah, there we go.
Oh, I think a few of us can add on this, but this as Kishan have been saying, this came as a result of the process of nationally determining and defining contribution. So this move of the collective obligation coming from a set international treaty to countries defining their contribution led to, okay, when these countries decide to define their targets, it's up to countries to define their base year, the time frame, even for the implementation, the reporting, but in particular to the reporting part, it's also linked to capacity of countries, so that there are very flexible requirements on what guidelines countries should be using, even the IPCC guidelines. So that detailed information of what needs to be provided is in the Katowice decision, general information that need to be submitted, but those are not defined as what they need to be. For example, a base year is not defined as 2005 or 1990. It's up to the country to define it. But it's one important thing that you need to define a base year when you communicate NDC. But the understanding is all this would be clarified when there is the global assessment and how that can be considered a total contribution of efforts of countries will be assessed in the global stocktake processes. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Salam. Did anyone else want to come in? No? Okay, moving on. So Kishan, over to you. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry. Just to add, there is ongoing discussions on ICTU of information to be provided by countries who submit the NDCs, regardless of whether it's an intensity target or business as usual deviation or absolute emissions reductions by a year. There is ongoing discussions on what information is to be provided by countries when they submit or update their NDCs that will enhance an understanding of what they are doing in terms of the processes, the quantification of the targets. So notwithstanding the variety of NDCs and the forms that they take, it is now being streamlined towards a template of understanding each other's NDC through the ICTU process. So I'll just add that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kishan. I'm conscious of time, so I'll take one more question. Actually, it's two very similar questions, and therefore Christoph, can historical responsibility be brought to bear in the negotiations, and or to what extent can legal action be taken against developing countries against developed countries under the Paris Agreement? We'll end on a big question.
Yeah, I think I wrote my first paper on this about 10 years ago, and the argument then was that along with the climate negotiations, it would be absolutely legitimate to for developing countries to also take legal action at the same time in order to put pressure on the negotiation process and reach agreement on historic responsibility and equity, for instance. I've had many of those conversations with negotiators over the years, but I think what happens is that when they report these ideas back to capital, the politicians or the most senior decision makers see the risks involved in such a contentious legal approach. So, I think it's really more a question for the active government officials, the negotiators, Salam and Kishan, whether there will ever be a point in time when, maybe as a means of last resort, they take legal action.
Kishan, Salam, would you like to come in? No, that's fine. Oh, Salam, please. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I was trying to see the time and also see how to respond to this very difficult question. I mean, the international law has processes that needs to be followed, but this is also the tricky situation where how do you bring a case? So these are really a legal kind of questions on how do you bring a legal justice question under the UNFCCC. Is there an avenue for it, or is it to the international, the ICJ courts where you as developing countries can come together and bring a litigation case? There have been cases even in the UNFCCC where G77 through South Africa, I think during the KP compliance process, brought against case on developed countries with regards to means of implementation. But these things are very political, and seeing that through would be very challenging in the UNFCCC process. But it doesn't mean that it will never happen. The international frameworks are there. It's about where to use it, how to use it, and it's really up to the countries to define that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Salam. We are now to time, so I'm going to bring this event to a close. I just wanted to thank all our speakers and thank everyone that's joined virtually for their time. I hope it's been an insightful and interesting sort of introduction to the guide to the Paris Agreement. Please don't forget that the guide is available online. But more importantly, if you want to secure yourself a hard copy of the book, please stay online for another 10 seconds and we'll post the questions up on the screen, including a link to LRI's email so that you could submit your answers instantly. That email address is also where anyone is able to submit any legal, technical queries or LRI. So please do make a note of that. But all that's left for me to say is thank you again. Do all keep safe and well in these challenging times, and look forward to hopefully meeting a lot of you in person very soon when we can. Thank you.